Good evening. I appreciate Roy's Devo, and this has always been family to me. That's just how I've always looked at it, I guess. Of course, I've known most of you most of my life, I think, but large portion of it. Knew you and I was still dark-headed anyway, right? so for quite a while. We're in Hebrews and kind of getting towards the end of Hebrews now. If I can get clicking here. Well, I ain't clicking for some reason. Why am I not clicking? Yep, I'm up. Nope, I'm not clicking. Huh? It is on, dear. See? There you go. We're moving. I know, we already been through this. We got to get to 12. There we go. So we talked quite a bit about this last week, maybe too much, but the idea of the goal of the cross, Jesus doing what he did because he was going back to where he was before, and the idea that that's kind of our goal is to do that. I think the Hebrew writer's leading into, as you'll see, he's leading into the idea of chastisement here, that God chastises his children. The idea that if we are chastised, if we have problems in our life, that, we should get through that. We should be able to go through that. But I think if you get into 4, I think this is a verse that we don't talk much about. I think it's a really interesting verse. It says, in your struggle against sin, you've not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you completely forgotten the word of encouragement that addressed you as children? That's something I've looked at that a lot. And I don't really know that I have a full grasp of it, exactly what he's trying to say here. The idea of not resisting to the point of violence, or that not resist to the point of somebody else taking violence against them. You can kind of look at it both ways, to the point of shedding your blood. I think when you look at Christ, and sometimes I get in trouble for this, but, Christ had how do I say this? He lived in a really corrupt world. Do you agree with that? He lived in an extremely corrupt world. I mean, we live in a bad world. But that world he lived in was bad. It was worse. Can you say worse than this one? Probably. It was bad, right? You had Romans, you had Greeks, you had idol worship, you had temples on every corner, you had war, you had all these different things going on. And Jesus could easily have been this political force, and they wanted him to be, didn't they? They wanted Jesus to be this political power, come in and say Judaism was right and Rome's wrong. But isn't it interesting that Jesus never went there? He lived in a corrupt society, and he allowed that to go on around him. And it really wasn't his desire to change the politics or to change the rule of the day or to change any of those things. His goal, his one goal, one mission was to start the church. And everything else to him was secondary. They always tried to pull him in, didn't they? Should you pay taxes to Caesar? Should you, knuckle under the government? Should you, they always tried to pull him in, always tried to get him in it. And yet Jesus consistently would not get involved in that, would he? He stayed away from it because that was not his mission. And it's interesting when you look at the cross and the garden and Peter cutting off the ear of Malchus, you see that his disciples, apostles, were ready to fight, right? They were ready to fight. Peter proved that. When Peter picked up that sword and cut off the ear of Malchus, Peter proved they were ready to fight. They were ready to go to war with Jesus right then. They were ready to pick up their swords, and they were ready to go fight. But Jesus said what? Put it away, right? And he healed the ear of Malchus, and he went to the cross. And isn't it funny that throughout early Christianity, Christians died by the millions. They didn't ever fight. They never tried to fight back. They never raised an army. They never tried to overthrow the government. They never did any of those things. They just died, and they died, and they died, and they died. And yet Christianity continued to grow. You know, Christianity didn't become militant until probably the Crusades, right? You know, so I mean, and that's a black eye on us, right? That was a black eye on Christianity, right? Because Jesus never did encourage that type of violence. He just didn't. The Bible, Jesus encouraged us to love each other, and he taught us that love can conquer everything else. And so I think when you look at this passage, maybe that's what the Hebrew writer is trying to say here, right? You're going to have this chastisement. You're going to have these things happen to you. But you have to really look at the goal in the end and not necessarily what's going on in your life right this second. He says, you completely forgotten, right? My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you. Because the Lord disciplines those he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his child. There's so much discussion about this. How does Jesus do this? Does God still do this, right? Does he chastise us? Does he discipline us? And if he does, how does he do it? That's almost an impossible question to answer. I mean, we just don't have enough information. If something bad happens to us, is that God disciplining us? Is it God chastising us? Do we believe in this karma idea, right, or not? Very difficult for us to understand. So I think we don't need to try to understand it. Because I think when we do, we put ourselves in a really bad position. Because we begin to look at life as this series of events that God sets into place that somehow you and I are having to go through like an obstacle course, right? And we can't do that with our life. We just can't. We can't live like that. You know, we have to take each day as it comes. We have to take whatever comes the best way we can as Christians. We have to, because I think if we begin to look at this like, oh, it's all part of this big plan and every bad thing that happens to me, that's the Lord disciplining me, then the logical thing we say after that is, why is he disciplining me? What did I do, right? Because if we discipline our child, if we discipline somebody in our life, we just don't take our children and decide we're going to give them a whooping just because we think they haven't had one in a long enough time and it's time to do it, right? Well, we might want to do that sometimes, but we don't do that, right? Because we that would be wrong. When we do anything to our children, when we discipline our children, it's because they've done something wrong, right? So if God disciplines us, essentially, it then logically leads to the conclusion that, well, if God's disciplining me, then I had to have done something wrong, you see? And then that really gets us down a dark path. So we really got to be careful how we think about this and how we look at this and how it comes with us. Yeah. Well, I don't know that you can, it's just difficult, isn't it? I mean, because if something bad happens to you, do you really think that God did that? Do you really think God reached down and said, well, Rex, I'm going to slap you around a little because you missed church on Sunday or something, I mean, whatever, I mean, it might kind of make us feel good that way because we're like, God's kind of, but on the other hand, God doesn't tend to deal as physically directly with us as he did in the Old Testament. So, yeah, go ahead. Huh? Well, because one thing we know is that, number one, if that was the case, then it kind of goes against some very ideas legitimately of what we read in the Bible, right? That, basically that our sin is forgiven, right? So if I sin against God as a Christian, technically, right, according to what I understand, and I repent of that sin, then my sin should be forgiven, right? So is God chastising me as a blood-washed Christian for something that I've done wrong, that kind of flies in the face of the idea of grace, doesn't it, a little bit? Well, I think it's difficult to define that, in life. Because the truth is, whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, bad things happen to people, right? And, as a Christian, sometimes we naturally look towards, well, that's God, right? Because I think as a Christian, that's how we look. That's how we define our life. But on the other hand, a lot of bad things happen to a lot of other people too. We're certainly not just because we're a Christian, we don't have the single avenue on bad things, right? Bad things happening to us, going through adversity, going through trial. Does God lead us in ways? Maybe. It's kind of a hard path when you go that way. You have to. It's hard to. Yeah. Right. Right. When you discipline your child, I think, like you said, you lose somebody in your life. And see, to me, that is, well, I think when you do that, you're like saying, okay, God's gonna, you know, basically God would snuff out a life in order to. See, I have a little bit of problem with that line of reasoning. And I've heard that my whole life. Literally, I've heard that my entire life. When I was a kid and a child would die or somebody would die out of season, I always heard that. Well, it's God's plan. It's God's plan. And that just tears me up inside. I just don't think God. When I discipline my child, I don't do anything. I would like to think I wouldn't be the kind of parent that would damage them irreparably. You know what I'm saying? I mean, there's a difference between discipline and just brutality. I guess I don't know how else to say it. Yeah. Right. And I think that's where the Christian side of it comes in. For us, we endure hardship as discipline. In other words, it's how we react to the hardships in our life. You know, we see that as a challenge to faith. I do. When I have really bad things happen in my life, whether or not I think God caused it or God didn't cause it or however I want to view that, I look at my reaction to what's happening in my life. I look at that as discipline for me as a Christian, how I react to what's going on, you know. And I think that's the Christian perspective as opposed to the non-Christian perspective of bad things happening. Right, and I think the other thing you got to look at this, you look at this passage, is the idea that you know, just because we're a Christian, you know, flip it around a little bit. Just because I'm a Christian doesn't mean that I'm not going to have hardships. You know what I'm saying? God's not going to put me in this bubble and say, well, you're a Christian, so now nothing's going to happen. Nothing bad's going to happen, you know. I'm still going to undergo hardships just as everybody else does. But how am I going to react to those hardships? What are those hardships going to teach me? How are they going to influence my faith? Right. But I think we still, it's how we react, regardless of how we think where that hardship's coming from, right? Yeah. Yeah. What was you going to say, Leela? Right. Yep, that's right. I agree with you. You know, this idea of being disciplined, this idea that God loves us and that we're going to go through things, that we're not exempt. Um, and the idea here that because of that discipline, you and I will be better people. We'll be better Christians. We'll be more holy, more godly. Um, I think once again we keep looking back towards Jesus here. You know, what he went through, what he endured from people, and how he reacted to their criticism, how he reacted to their hate. And, you know, Jesus could just have easily have struck back, but he didn't, right? Discipline's never pleasant, right? But it produces righteousness and peace for those who have been trained. And I believe that. I believe that when you go through things in your life and you come through the other side, if you come through it with God, I believe there's a peace, there's a tranquility. Maybe there's a confidence in the idea that I know I can make it through, you know? I think that's a big thing to me. When you come through something, whatever that might be, you think, well, you know, if I can make it through this, right, I can make it through something else, you know? So that's what we have to do as Christians. You know, we have to look at our life, how we react to what goes on. You never know. You know, it's just like Roy said. It's just like what I say. You know, you come to that point in your life where you just realize how little control you have over everything around you. You know, you just don't have it. And we are reactive. 95% of our lives, we're reactive people, aren't we? Do you agree with that? We eat because we're hungry. We sleep because we're tired. We go to the doctor because we hurt, right? We'd probably be ahead if we went to the doctor and we were well and tried to stay healthy. But generally we don't do that, right? We wait till we hurt, right? We wait till people, we wait till things are falling apart before we try to put them back together, whether that's people's lives or marriages or whatever. We're reactive. Most of our lives we're reactive because we're not in control of what's going on for the most part. So we just react to whatever, we react to the situation. That's what we have to do. And, some days I get up and I think I got it figured out. I know what I'm going to do that day. My goal's in front of me. I got it down, and I never get there because the whole day I'm reacting to what's going on around me. Get that call, this happens. Next thing you know, I've gone through my whole day, and all I've done all day is react to things that I didn't even know were going to happen when I got up that morning, So we're very reactive, aren't we? And I think that's kind of where we are as humans. And because of that, we have to always kind of be in that game, don't we? And how we're going to react to what happens, to the next phone call, the next person, the next whatever. How are we going to react? So we have to strengthen ourselves, right? Make level paths for your feet so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. I think the Hebrew writer is saying here is that, we have, and see, I think that's where people miss this, is that we have agency in all this, So many people think, well, I shouldn't say so many, but a lot of people in my life have got this idea that God's got this so in control of all this that we really don't have any agency ourselves in what happens. But the Bible never teaches that. We have agency in what happens in our lives. It says here, make level paths for your feet. That's what we do, right? That's proactive. How do you do that, right? How do you do that? Well, you become more proactive about things, for one thing, right? You try to stop problems before they happen. You try not to go through discipline because you try not to make the same mistakes over and over and over again, right? So we can be proactive in what we do. Make level paths, it says, so that we can be healed. So there's a lot here in this, and sometimes I think we struggle, but I think the important thing we got to understand here is that we have agency. We can decide. You and me, we have will. We have free will, right? Isn't that what he really starts to get into when he gets to 14? Make the effort to live in peace with everyone and to be holy, right? Live in peace with everyone. They lived in a world of hate. They lived in a world, the Jews hated them, the Romans hated them, everybody hated them, everybody hated each other, right? And yet here, the Hebrew writer says what? He says, make every effort to live in peace with everyone. Well, that's a pretty tall order, isn't it? Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. The idea that we should be above the world. We should be holy people in an unholy world. We shouldn't act like the world. We shouldn't be the world. See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. Those are things we do. It's not saying God does that. We do that. We're the ones. It says, what does it say? It says, no one falls short of the grace, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble. That's something we do. That's not God doing that. That's something you and I do. If you had people in your life that you knew were trouble, I have. I've had people in my life that I knew they were going to be trouble. I knew it, And when I let those people in and I let them cause trouble, that was on me. That was my decision to do that. You and I, we have responsibility to protect our family, to protect the ones that we love, to protect our church family. We have a responsibility to do that. And that's our action. That's our agency as Christians. We have to be above the idea, and I think when you get into 16 here, this idea of being sexually immoralist or as godless like Esau. Isn't that an interesting parallel? Sexually immoral or godless like Esau. Have you ever really thought about that parallel? What did Esau do? The Bible says, right? Sold his birthright, didn't he? How do you think that parallels with being sexually immoral? I mean, there's a parallel here. It's in the same place. Traded everything for a moment. You're right, exactly right. You know, how many times would people, if people knew the consequences of their action, how many times would they decide maybe it's just not worth it to do that? You know, but just many times they never think past the moment, do they? It's all the moment, isn't it? And I heard that actually read a thing. I was reading a book from a marriage counselor the other day, and that's one thing that he brought up on immorality, on adultery, if you want to look at it that way, or spouses cheating on one another. That's one thing that he really brought up. He says they don't look past the moment, you know, and I think that's true here. It's the same thing that Esau did. Esau didn't look past. He said, I'm starving to death, right? What good is it if I starve to death? And you and I both know if he was able to say he was starving to death, he probably wasn't going to starve to death in the next 10 minutes, right? But he did that, right? He thought right there, and it defined him. It defined him. You and I should be people that look for a delayed gratification. Isn't that kind of what this is saying? You're going to go through hardship, but look to the end. Delayed gratification. You know, there was a study done I read about several years ago about these children, and they were 5 or 6 years old, I can't remember, and they took these groups of children, and they basically took them into this room one at a time, and they set them at this table, and they put candy on this table, and they said, you can either eat this candy bar, whatever it was, I don't remember how exactly it went. You can either eat this now, or I'll be back in 5 minutes with a whole box of candy. And so some kids, you can imagine, some kids just ripped that candy open and ate it, right? And some kids, they waited for the box of candy. Well, the interesting thing about the study is they followed these kids for 15 years. And they determined that the children who ripped into the candy turned out to be much less successful and unhappier people than the kids who actually waited for that 15 years earlier. And there was a study about delayed gratification. You know, if we can look to the longer goal, look past the now, as Brent would say, right? Esau looked to the now, right? He looked to the minute. Esau didn't look down the road. He's going to lose that blessing, going to lose the inheritance, going to lose all that. You know, people who oftentimes are caught in a situation with adultery or sometimes theft, sometimes embezzlement, those people don't look past that minute. They look at that minute. Gratification right there. God says no. We have to look past that, don't we? He wanted to inherit his blessing, but he was rejected, right? Even though he sought the blessing with tears, he could not change what he had done. There's a lesson in that. Sometimes we do things in life and we can't change our action. We can't change what we've done. Even if we want to go back and change it, we can't change it. Boy, how many times would I like to take back something I said the second after I said it? You know, or take back something I did the minute after I did it. Boy, it'd be nice to get about 10 of them in your life at least, wouldn't it? Them take backs, so you could just like erase it and start over. But we don't get it, do we? We can't take it back. It says, you have not come to a mountain that can be touched. This is looking back towards the Old Testament when God was on the mountain. They couldn't touch the mountain. They couldn't approach it or they would die. Here the Hebrew writer says, listen, that's not who we are anymore. We're not these people. God's not unreachable, untouchable to us. And that's big for us because you and I, we need to understand that we have confidence before Christ, that we've come to Mount Zion. And I think Zion's such an interesting term in the Bible. Zion always means the city of God, is what it always means in Scripture. So sometimes we talk about Jerusalem and we say, well, Mount Zion. But of course, that's really not the city of God anymore. Heaven's the city of God. So now we talk about Zion. We talk about God's city, which is heaven. So this isn't talking about Jerusalem, even though the Jews would think Zion was Jerusalem. But we know it's heaven. And that's exactly what the Hebrew writer says. We've come to the heavenly Jerusalem, not the Jerusalem here, not anything on this earth. and thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly. To the church of the firstborn, whose names are written in heaven, you have come to God, the judge of all, and the spirits of the righteous made perfect. And that goes right back to 11. To Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks better than the blood of Abel. See to it you do not refuse him who speaks. If they did not escape and they refused him who warned them on earth, how much less will we if we turn away from him who warns us from heaven? At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised once more, I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. The words once more indicate the removing of what can be shaken, that is, created things. You know, this really speaks to the end, that there's not going to be another heavenly, Christ isn't going to come back, Christ isn't going to reign from earth. It's the end. What's going to be shaken is going to be removed. This is done. This earth will be done. And the heavens will be done. And you know, it's kind of interesting, you know, how we look at that, but this will all be gone. It says, but, right, what could not be shaken will remain. Therefore, instead of receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, which is God's kingdom, let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. You know, as we get to the end of Hebrews, he really starts to be more uplifting. The idea that we're coming to a heavenly city, a heavenly Jerusalem, to something that can't be shaken. And even though this earth can be bad, it can be trials, it can be tribulation, we can have all these things going on, we have to look to the long goal. We have to look towards heaven, just as he started with 12, as Jesus did, looking towards heaven and not looking towards the things of this earth. You know, that's how we get through this, is we keep our eye on God. If we ever take our eye off, that's when we lose. We have to keep our eye on God. You know, bad things happen. Terrible things happen. But you know, it's our only hope. Without Jesus, without God, without Christ, there is no hope. There's no hope. And I think that's something that we have to really consider. So we're almost to the end. 13 be the end. It says here, the start of the conclusion of Hebrews. Once again, look for the word therefore. And I always try to have you look at those words because it always helps you to look back. Persecution was happening. The Jewish Christians were admonished to focus on the goals. An athlete would focus on the finish line. Compares the old Mount Sinai to the new Mount Zion. Makes us see we do not want to go back to the old. Most importantly, assures of a kingdom that cannot be shaken, with the assurance that God will repay the evil against Christians. And now we get to the last chapter of Hebrews, right? And I think this is such a wonderful chapter. You know, keep on loving one another as brothers and sisters. Boy, if we could just do that, right? You know, this is a family. And you know, families have trouble sometimes. That's the reality. You know, I think I got a good family. I think I have good kids. Got a wonderful wife. I think I have had good parents. I think I have a good family. But you know, I've had problems in my family. There's times we ain't got along. There's times we've even yelled at each other. You know, we've had our moments. But you know what? We're still a family. We still love each other, right? You know, the truth is we forget that sometimes as Christians. We think, well, the church ought to just be perfect. We ought to always agree. We should never hurt each other's feelings. Everybody should just be happy. It ought to just be wonderful all the time. That's not family. That's some dream that's not a reality. You know, I think the biggest mistake we can ever make is to think that, you know, we just got to put on a show and be perfect. You know, it's okay. It's all right. It's all right to have problems. It's okay. You know, it's how we get through them. That's what matters. It's our forgiveness, our love, the way that we deal with one another. That's what's important. And you know, we just have to really focus on that sometimes. And I think sometimes we just forget. We just forget. You know, my aunt, Audra, she was, and my granny, you know, of course, most of y'all know me, I talk about my granny all the time. And Aunt Audra, they would all go to church. And Audra had two boys, Steve and Dan, my cousins. They were hippies. I just loved them. had a chartreuse microbus. Anyway, but I just love them boys. You know, and it's funny how the people, they just rejected God as adults. And I always kind of wondered about that. But you know, they never, my aunt was very much put on a show type person. She come to church and acted like everything was perfect, and her life wasn't even close to perfect. She dressed right, she acted right, she talked right, and she made the church be like this showcase for like perfection. And those boys, it turned them against God because they saw it as hypocritical. They didn't see truthfully what a family is, what a church is. You know, for many years, I think we did that in the church. We put on our best clothes, and I think we should dress nice to come to church. I'm not saying that. But we put on the very best clothes we could put on. We put on our best face. We put on our best smile. We walked in the door, and we shook each other's hands, and we said everything was good, and everything was fine, and everything was wonderful. And the truth is, it's not that way anywhere all the time, is it? Is it? Nowhere that it's that way all the time, you know? And that's a mistake when we do that, because that's not what family's about. Family's about getting through the hard times and getting through the good times, and about crying together and laughing together and sharing one another's burdens. Family's about being family. And you don't always have to agree with me. Sometimes you don't even have to like me if you don't want to. It's all right. We're still family. You know, we still love each other. That's okay. There's been times I didn't like my kids very much, to be honest about it, but I still loved them. They were still my kids, right? So don't ever forget that. This isn't no perfect. We're not perfect. We're far from perfect, but we're supposed to love each other. We're supposed to show hospitality to strangers, aren't we? We're supposed to, and that's a difficult passage, isn't it? Hospitality to angels without knowing it. We struggle with that. I don't know what to tell you about that. I don't know if that's just them. I don't know if that still happens. I've had sometimes have people walk into my life, and I wondered if they were an angel. I don't know if they were or not. You know, I just don't know. You know, treat everybody good, right? Isn't that what he's saying? You never know, right? Treat everybody good, because you never know. He says, continue to remember those in prison as if you were together with them. And those are, of course, we're talking about here, those in prison for the gospel, right? Isn't that really what we're talking about here? Those in prison for Christ, those that have been in prison because of their belief, because of their faith, right? Those who are mistreated as if you or yourselves were suffering. In other words, we should feel for each other, right? Marriage is to be held in honor, and the marriage bed is to be undefiled. For fornicators, adulterers, God will judge. Make sure that your character is free from the love of money, being content with what you have. For he himself has said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you. So that we confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What will man do to me? You know, it's very encouraging words, very true words, to be content with what we have, to be content with our marriage. Isn't it funny how he puts marriage there and then right immediately he goes to contentment? You ever really notice how he does that? You know, be content with what you have, right? And I think if we're content with our marriage, if we're content with our life, we're not looking for something else. We're not looking for someone else. We're not looking for an escape. People look for an escape because they're not content with what they have. And here, the Hebrew writer says we need to learn to be content with what we possess, content with who we are. And I think that's important that we do that. Yeah. Well, I agree, but once again, I wouldn't say that contentment is all about not having conflict. You know, I don't think that's true. I think, you know, conflict is part of life. You know, disagreement is part of human nature. It's how we deal with that. We can still have contentment in a relationship even if we don't always agree with one another. We can still be content. So, you know, I think as Christians, we have to, once again, look to the bigger picture sometimes, right? Look to the bigger picture. Pick your battles. Pick the hills you want to die on, you know. Some things aren't that important in the end. And sometimes we need to learn to let some of those things go and think that's really not that big a deal. Quit trying to control people around us, right? Decide that the only person I can really control is me. and be content with that. You know, I think sometimes, so many times, our contentment is about with maybe our spouse, our children, or people in our work relationship or other settings, is that, you know, we get that way because we want to control them. We want them to be what we want them to be. And sometimes, you know, I can't do that to somebody else. I need to love them for the person they are. I need to understand that the only thing I can control in any situation is Rex. You know, and I forgot that for most of my life. You know, I always try to control people. You know, I always want to try to make them do what I want them to do. You know, do what I want you to do. You know, and I can't do that. You know, at the end of the day, I'm the only person that I can control. And that's part of contentment, is coming to knowing who you are and knowing that God knows who you are. You know, confidence within ourselves, contentment within ourselves, it comes from us, you know. It's not external. Contentment is not external. Contentment is internal. And we have to understand that. You know, why are we uncontent? We're out of time. Why most of the time we're uncontent is because we're looking at other people. Am I right? And we think, well, why do they have that? Why don't I have that? What are they, right? We're looking at somebody else when we should be looking at ourselves, finding contentment with what I have and who I am. I just think these are important things. We'll spend a little more time on this next Wednesday night. We're going to Genesis. I've been wanting to do Genesis for a long time, so we're going to Genesis when we get done here. So anyway, see you next Wednesday.